onto your butt.
Da-da-da. Oh, hello. Welcome to episode 150 of the Civil War Breakfast Roll podcast. Once again, I'm joined by Mary, the Six Spice Girl, formerly known as La Batty Spice. I'm just a wannabe named Darren. Tell me what you want. What you really want, Mary. How we doing?
I was not expecting that.
Yeah. Well, you know what? That's what people expect. That's what life is. So what's
Maybe
happening?
I should shake it to the right. Like...
No, don't. God, no.
Oh, wait. No, it was the left. I was going to say, like John Bell Hood wanted.
Shimmy to the left. Don't you know?
Oh.
Unbelievable. So what's going on? How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing really, really well. Really well. So what do you, I'm going to be a good host today and just jump right off of it now and ask you, what are you drinking?
So I'm drinking Argyle Sweater from Appalachian Brewing, which is just down the street from us here in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania.
Very exciting.
And what are you drinking?
Oh, any mug? Or?
Oh, mug. I just have a generic Gettysburg mug because the general we're going to talk about, he fought in many different battles, but he was here at Gettysburg during Pickett's charge.
Oh.
So that's why I picked that.
Very good. Okay.
And what about you?
Oh, thank you so much. I didn't think you were going. I'm drinking, it's actually a cider, Mary, from Blake's Hard Cider. It's called Big Jam. Just because.
Big Jam. From Michigan.
From Michigan, there we go. And I'm drinking it from my Iron Brigade coffee mug, which is going to be very appropriate. Because what I really, really want, Mary, is to talk about John Gibbon, a very underrated officer in the Union Army that rose through the ranks and became one of the, if not the, most dependable officer in the entire Union Army.
I would definitely agree with that after, doing the research about him, reading his memoirs. Well, I didn't read all his memoirs for this, but I did read parts of his memoirs to prep for this episode, and they're really, really good. He's very detailed. He's very, just meticulous in what he includes. And I've always thought that Gibbon was one of those guys that doesn't get enough credit. And he's a guy that I've always thought, like, well, why is he not commanding a corps at some point?
Well, he probably wanted to know that too. But I mean, Gibbon was an enigmatic fellow who was a firm disciplinarian. He also had sympathy for his men, and that would earn his admiration. But he was a true leader who went full tilt, full time, and the man commanding, the commander, General George Meade, counted on him to save the Union line at that critical moment of the Battle of Gettysburg. And for the most part, Gibbon was front and center for most of the big boy battles in the East from 1862 right until the end and beyond, all while fighting the stigma of being considered a Southerner who chose to honor his oath to the United States and fight to maintain the Union.
But what's interesting about Gibbon is he's actually born in Philadelphia. So he starts his life as a Northerner. He's born April 20th, 1827. He's the fourth of 10 children born to John Haysham Gibbon and Catherine Lardner Gibbon. And when he's 11 years old, his family moves to Charlotte, North Carolina after his father takes a position as the chief assayer, I hope I'm saying that correctly, of the U.S. Mint. Mm-hmm. So this basically means his father was the one who would test the composition of the metals that were being put into the coins.
How his hands must have smelt up to work every day.
God,
Hold a bunch of pennies. But to correct you,
gross.
Mary, he was actually born in Holmesburg, Pennsylvania, which is a portion of Northeast Philadelphia. And the reason why I know this, modern politicals will recognize Holmesburg as the location of the infamous Four Seasons Total Landscaping Parking Lot press conference in 2020. So that's why Holmesburg always stuck in my mind.
Four Seasons.
Well, that's true. But like I said before, what's interesting about the Gibbons, he was born to Dr. John and Catherine Gibbons with an S, who dropped the S at some point and went by the surname Gibbon.
Mm-hmm. And he was, came from a large family. In 1847, he graduates from West Point, and he was commissioned a brevet second lieutenant in the 3rd U.S. Artillery. He's going to serve in Florida when the wars with the Seminoles are going on and the settlers. And while he does serve in the Mexican-American War with the 3rd Artillery, he doesn't really see any combat there at all.
Well, let's just go back a little bit and talk about some details about that, too. And you mentioned before, he was basically a rich kid, number 4 of 10 kids to a wealthy family in the South, and they were slave owners. Mm-hmm. And John spent much of his formative years as a Southerner and within that institution of slavery. Now, Gibbon never really wrote, nor did he ever was quoted about his opinion of slavery. So his attitude towards it is always left to interpretation. But, hints on his attitudes towards things like Native Americans provide a possible insight into his mind. But again, that's up to the eye of the beholder. But, you mentioned the class of 1847. He did earn an appointment to West Point on September 1st, 1842. He was supposed to be part of the star-studded class of 1846, Mary, which included Generals George McClellan, Jesse Reno, George Pickett, and of course the great Cadmus Wilcox. But at West Point, Mary, there were problems.
Yep.
He had problems at West Point. Just like you, He was a mediocre student. He included poor grades in English grammar, so you can imagine his Facebook posts would probably criticize all the time for grammar at West Point.
See, that's surprising to me because he's a I find him to be a very, very good writer, and he was known for his writing post-Civil War. Now, I will say this, when I was like typing out some of quotes from his memoirs, I was wanting to put commas in certain areas. I'm like, oh, he's not putting commas, so that explains that.
No, it's probably a your versus your situation, you know. But he also had some disciplinary issues too, you know, which is also ironic considering his ironclad adherence to discipline that would basically define his character for the rest of his life. So he was given a choice. He said, you can leave West Point, or you can repeat a year to improve your grades and join the class of 1847 a year later than expected. So what does he do? He's going to take the do-over. He'll finish 20th of 38 in that class of 47. He'll graduate with guys like Ambrose Burnside, Henry Heath, A.P. Hill, the man who was itching and scratching throughout the commencement ceremony on July 1st of 47. But normally getting held back a year in school isn't a big deal. I mean, you know. But for Gibbon, it's a substantial career consequence. And you mentioned being a second brevet lieutenant in the 3rd U.S. Artillery. By that time, Gibbon had got to Mexico. It was just about over.
Yep.
So that year he was delayed, cost him most of the significant battles. If he graduated in 46 on time, he would have joined his classmates like McClellan in Mexico. But he got to the ball game with 2 outs in the 9th inning, and he missed out on that valuable Mexican War experience that many of his future Civil War officers got. So again, the moral of the story, Mary, is make sure you know the difference between your and your. But C's do get degrees, so Gibbon did graduate, and he got through it. But there was one really good story in Mexico, and one experience he learned the hard way when he did get down there was not to gamble your money on a card game with experienced military officers. So one night in 1847, he's sitting around in Mexico with some officers, nobody famous, but just obscure officers, and they asked Gibbon to join their game of cards. I assume it was poker, but who knows? Who knows?
Maybe go fish.
Oh, no, maybe, very well could have, you know. But anyway, Gibbon said he joined the game with, quote, a few dollars, a horse, and a pistol. The next morning, I had to borrow a few dollars, a horse, and a pistol. So what is he saying? That he lost everything, and he never really gambled with officers ever again. So he learned the hard way about gambling. And after Mexico, he was briefly sent to Fort Monroe in Virginia in 1848, but he was transferred down to Fort Brooke to fight the Seminoles. Now, you know, Gibbon spent 2 years in Florida where he met 2 people who would make a very significant impact on him for the rest of his career. The first one was Captain John Casey. Casey was born in England in 1809 and was a West Point classmate of one Robert E. Lee and one Joseph E. Johnson. Casey was a captain of Fort Brooke, and he treated the Seminoles with such respect it left a lasting impression on Gibbon, one that he remembered later in his life. Gibbons wrote of Casey, quote, he never deceived them, never told one of them a lie, and never made a promise he did not fulfill if within his power. The other man he met in Florida was an engineer named who? George Meade, who was in Fort Brooke to help with the Seminoles as well as build some lighthouses at Key Largo, Jupiter, as well as the Keys. Now this is key because Gibbon and Meade would become close friends in Florida, which is going to help his career later on.
Yeah, it certainly will at the Gettysburg campaign.
You know who else was at Fort Brooke in 1850?
Wasn't it Sherman?
Nope, Thomas Jackson.
Interesting.
Yeah, he was there as well as a Virginian. Perhaps you heard of him. Went by a nickname I can't seem to remember. But on September 12th of 1850, Gibbon joined what would become the famous Battery B of the 4th U.S. Artillery when he was down in Texas, and he would remain there until 1854, when he returned to West Point to become the assistant instructor of artillery on September 25th, 1854.
And in 1855, just to get this in there, Gibbon marries Frances Fanny North Mole, and they are going to have 4 children. Frances Mole Gibbon, Catherine Katie Lardner Gibbon, John Gibbon Jr., and John S. Gibbon.
She was a Catholic from Baltimore. So that was
interesting.
It should be pointed out. But by far, at West Point, the most significant accomplishment Gibbon had during his time back at West Point again was when he wrote what would become the gold standard book on artillery in 1859 called the Artillerist Manual. The New York Times said of it, quote, this book may well be considered as a valuable and important addition to the military science of the country. You know what I did, Mary, yesterday? I went to Amazon and I looked it up to see the reviews. It gets 3 out of 5 stars on Amazon.
That's it?
Including a 1-star review, which I imagine was left by the ghost of Richard Garnett. Probably taking revenge on Gibbon for his artillery, probably. But somebody give him a 1-star review. The prime book on
Garnett,
artillery.
1 star would not recommend.
I would not, absolutely not. So on November 2nd of 1859, Gibbon would become captain of that Battery B. He'll be sent to Camp Floyd in Utah for the Utah expedition, along with Albert Sidney Johnson and Winfield Scott Hancock. Based on the Utah expedition, the Mormons under Brigham Young didn't feel they needed to adhere to U.S. policies, such as paying taxes.
Yep.
And the military had to go up there to remind them, yep, you do. And guess what? They pay taxes. so there you go. So the secession crisis is boiling now. Gibbon's going to get returned east of Fort Crittenden, and soon later, Fort Sumter is going to be fired upon in Charleston Harbor, which, of course, is going to begin the American Civil War.
It was interesting reading, because Gibbon is at Camp Floyd for part of the succession crisis, and he talks about how like slow the news was in those days. Like, I mean, obviously it is. They don't have the technology we have for, texting or using the phone or email or whatever. But he says that in those days, the stagecoach and Pony Express were the only means of communication across the continent. But a telegraph line had already been projected, and a portion as far as Fort Kearny on the plate was completed. And Gibbon said in those days at the fort, they would have a pony day, and this was the specified hour. The officers would assemble at the post trader's store, and as soon as the bag of mail would arrive, an eager crowd would gather around, and the news would be read. And Gibbon describes as the secession crisis is going on that people at the camp are becoming more and more anxious as to news of war. And Gibbon recalled that looking back now and reading in the official records, the correspondence between Beauregard and Anderson, the whole scene comes before me like a long forgotten dream. He describes there being silent, anxious faces as the reader told of Beauregard's summons and Anderson's reply, the threat to open fire, and the announcement that at the end of the specified time the guns did open and that the harbor of Charleston reverberated with the sound of cannon, manned on both sides by brothers and lifelong friends firing at each other. So this is going to be Gibbon's moment where he is when the American Civil War begins. Likely and that was interesting to read in his memoirs that he remembers where this is. And he describes just the anxiety going forward of not knowing what's going to happen in the camp, and how that some of the Southern officers, they start to resign their commissions and go home. And he said all of them, probably with one exception, were looked upon with a certain amount of suspicion and distrust not calculated to add to the social feeling among us. I don't know who the one exception was, but he said there was, like, they all didn't trust, like, the Southern officers were not trusted.
And for Gibbon, this was a nightmare and forced him to make the ultimate decision for him. Because remember, he's a Southerner. Should he fight with his home state of North Carolina, or as a military officer who took an oath to defend the Constitution, would he honor that and remain loyal to the Union? Now, his family was very pro-Southern. They were Democrats. 3 of his brothers had already decided to join the Confederate Army. So remaining with the Union likely meant being disowned by his family. Now, his brothers Nicholas and Robert, they joined the 28th North Carolina, while a third brother, Lardner, we mentioned him a little while ago, the former U.S. Navy hero from his days in the Amazon in 1851, would become the captain of artillery and ordnance officer of a battery on the shores of Mobile, Alabama. So, again, not only that, but his fellow officers at Fort Crittenden also distrusted him as a Southerner, you were kind of hinting at. Gibbon was accused one time by other officers of being disloyal, and said there he requested now that the military band play Dixie, something that Gibson flatly denied. It was ultimately exonerated for it, but that's what was going on. Of course, he struggled with that decision, but eventually he did choose his path. John Gibbon would honor his oath and stay true to the Union, which would immediately led to his family cutting ties with him for it.
I wondered how that went because I couldn't find any information about that. Interesting, too. 2 of his brothers-in-law fought for the Confederacy, and so did his cousin, J. Johnston Pettigrew.
That's right. He did. He certainly will. We'll talk about Pettigrew a little bit later on. But Gibbon was then sent to Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, where his Battery B, 4th Artillery. And then after a quick stop in St. Joseph, Missouri, he made his way to Washington. Now, when he got to the nation's capital, he was appointed Chief of Artillery in Irvin McDowell's division, which included his own Battery B, as well as 3 additional volunteer batteries, the 1st New Hampshire, Battery D, the 1st Rhode Island, and the 1st New York Battery L. Now, the thing about Gibbon is he is a natural leader who literally wrote the book on artillery. Irvin McDowell said of Gibbon, quote, a natural talent for dealing with the volunteer soldier whose possibilities as well as limitations he appreciated from the first. Now, it didn't take long till he kind of grew. By May of 1862, Gibbon was promoted to command an infantry brigade called the Camas, Wisconsin Brigade. This brigade consisted of the 2nd, 6th, and 7th Wisconsin, as well as the 19th Indiana, along with his Battery B of that 4th Artillery. Now, he probably should have gotten brigade command sooner, but again, he was looked upon as a Southerner, and he had no political friends in Washington to look out for him. So everything he did, he kind of did on his own. It was no surprise that initially Gibbon was not liked by these Westerners. He was an artillery officer from the South who demanded discipline from his men. He was tough, but he was also very, very fair.
Yeah, and one of the soldiers described him as a most thorough disciplinarian, and the manner in which he put the brigade through drill will never be forgotten by those who participated. There were early morning drills, drills before breakfast, forenoon drills, evening and night drills, besides guard mounting and dress parade. Probably no brigade commander was ever more cordially hated by his men. And Gibbon's also described as a soldier in both looks and deeds. So that means he's very much a leader. He's, as you said, and as the quote from the soldier, he's a strict disciplinarian, but he's also looking out for his men too. And he also wants his men to be able to fight. That's one thing he talks about in his memoirs, that he's realizing he's got some green troops, and he's like, we have to be prepared for battle.
He was fair, but he was tough. He was like a good laxative Mary. He's gentle but thorough. That's what he was, right?
I didn't think we'd go there today, but here we are.
But the thing is if a soldier behaved or did well, Gibbon often rewarded him with furloughs and other incentives.
Yeah.
If they didn't do well, if he screwed up or was lazy, the soldier was often made to stand at attention on top of a barrel for hours at a time as a punishment. This carrot and stick approach was unique, and eventually the men learned to appreciate Gibbon. You know, you mentioned a quote a second ago. Another quote by a guy named Rufus Dawes of the 6th Wisconsin wrote, he was anxious that his brigade should excel in every way. While he was an exacting disciplinarian, he had the good sense to recognize merit where it existed.
Yep.
No, go ahead.
He realized, if he gives the soldiers a 24-hour pass, they're going to be better behaved because they're able to get out and let out whatever frustrations, anxiety they have by doing that. And he recognizes that. It was also said that when Gibbon's brigade marched, there was no straggling. And that's one thing Gibbon could not stand, was stragglers.
It was. He was creating a very unique group of men. The other distinction was the uniforms that Gibbon outfitted his men in. His men wore tall black hardy hats, long dark coats, and dark pants. They also wore white leggings, which the men hated. One time in Campton, Washington, some of his men dressed Gibbon's horse with light white leggings as a prank, something Gibbon did not like and did not forget. His brigade would be nicknamed the Black Hat Brigade and later called the Black Hats by the Confederates. Gibbon's Westerners drilled hard and they looked good. A correspondent with the Army wrote, the boys no longer look like beggars. Yeah. So that's the thing. You work hard, look hard, the whole deal.
They stood out, and one issue Gibbon had with them was the destruction of fences, because the men would want to take them down for fuel, and they just thought that, it's the property of the miserable secessionists who were the cause of their being here away from their families and comfortable homes. Well, Gibbon issues an order saying, don't take down the fences. And if a fence was torn down, the command that was camped near it was required to rebuild it. And someone reported him to Washington, saying, like, this guy's being unfair. And they also said, they went a step further and said he's not loyal to the Union for this. Like, basically, again, calling him out for being a Southerner, that, Gibbon should turn a blind eye to these guys destroying property and taking down the fences and all that.
Well, that Southern thing is going to hang with him right to the very end. But he'll be assigned to Rufus King's 1st Division of the 3rd Corps under Irvin McDowell. That Black Hat Brigade is going to get their trial by fire at the Battle of Bronner's Farm on August 28th of 1862. Now, there they'd fight and hold off troops under Stonewall Jackson for hours, despite being outnumbered 3-1. Another 18 for Stonewall, by the way, just saying right there. Okay? But 2 days later, after the Battle of Second Manassas, Gibbon's men, primarily Edward Bragg's 6th Wisconsin, they acted as that Union anchor to buy time for the rest of the army to retreat. Now, despite already having 2 battles under their belts, it was the Battle of South Mountain on September 1462 that really helped Gibbon's Black Hats earn their stripes. Now, we did a whole episode on this, so I'm not going to get into too much detail, but at Turner's Gap, Gibbon's going to find himself fighting troops of the 13th Alabama, the 27th, 6th, 23rd, and 28th Georgia, commanded by their division commander and North Carolinian Daniel Harvey Hill. Mm-hmm. Now, Gibbon and Hill were so close that John and his brother Larner were best men at D.H. Hill's wedding.
Yep.
And so they all knew each other being from North Carolina. Not only was he fighting Hill, but he was fighting the 28th North Carolina there, which included his brothers Nicholas and Robert. So it was truly a battle of brother against brother at South Mountain. Yep. Which you can only imagine how that must have gone.
Oh,
right?
it's tough fighting where they are at South Mountain as well, because they're going. I mean, if anybody's been there, you've seen the terrain. It's not fun.
No, not for me. But Gibbon's Black Hats, they're going to fight Alfred Colquitt's brigade along that national road and drive them back up South Mountain. Now, Gibbon is going to fight ferociously, and the only thing that saved the Rebs was the darkness. That night, a legendary story was created, which is probably not true, but it's a good story, right? And this is the one with the Army of the Potomac commanding general, George McClellan, allegedly said to First Corps Commander Joseph Hooker of Gibbon's men, "Look at those men, they must be made of iron." And then Hooker responded, "By God, they are made of iron." And the moniker the Iron Brigade was born, okay? Now, there's a problem, Mary, with this whole thing.
Yep.
The only problem is with that story is that there was already an Iron Brigade in the Army of the Potomac, a brigade of New Yorkers under the command of Colonel Walter Phelps. This was the 22nd, the 24th, the 30th New York, along with the 14th New York Chasseurs, right? They were given the name the Iron Brigade earlier by General Marcena Patrick after watching them march 50 miles from Catlet Station to Fredericksburg, Virginia. Now, Phelps' men wore the Iron Brigade title with pride. They stitched it to their kepis, writing on their flag. They carried that nickname into Antietam, not Gibbon's men. The Iron Brigade and Antietam were Phelps, right? But Phelps kept the Iron Brigade's nickname until early of 1863, when they mustered out and Gibbon's Black Hats inherited it. But Phelps' men were very proud to be called that, so I doubt that McClellan-Hooker dialogue happened like that. It might have been who those guys that made of iron.
Well, Gibbon does say in his memoirs, he says, all he remarks of the Iron Brigade is, how or where the name of the Iron Brigade was first given, I do not know. But soon after the Battle of Antietam, the name was started and ever after applied to the brigade. But there is another story that happens after South Mountain, and this is a story of McClellan meeting with a soldier from Gibbon's brigade, from the Black Hat Brigade. And he's gone to turn some prisoners over to McClellan. And when McClellan found out he was from Gibbon's brigade, McClellan stated, "You made a splendid fight." And the soldier said to have smiled at him and said, "Well, General, that's the way we boys calculate to fight under a general like you." Apparently, McClellan responded, "My man, if I can get that kind of feeling amongst the men of this army, I can whip Lee without any trouble at all." So the Iron Brigade story is definitely in question, but I think what isn't in question is that McClellan did note how hard these guys fought that day. And so I think that's somewhere where this story comes from. But Gibbon does acknowledge it. He's like, I don't know where the hell it came from. Like,
I mean, it was definitely earned, but there was factually a brigade that called themselves the Iron Brigade that did exist throughout Antietam. It was a bunch of New Yorkers, and far be it from me to give credit to New Yorkers, Mary, but you got to call a strike, right? You got to do it. But Gibbon's men found themselves again, you mentioned Antietam, in front of David Miller's cornfield along with Battery B on September 17th of 1862, which is the Battle of Antietam. And Gibbon wrote of it, "Bullet, shot, and shell whistled and screamed around us." Antietam was hell for many that day, but especially for Gibbon's Black Hats. Now, if you study the Battle of Antietam, Battery B is famous there. Battery B became the focal point of the battle as Confederates wanted to capture it. Now, it was captained at this point, not by Gibbon anymore, by a guy named Joseph Campbell, and they fired their 6 guns ferociously at the rebels. But Gibbon's noticed that the shells all seemed to be overshooting their targets. So Gibbon, the battery's former commander, he's going to climb down from his horse, and he's going to inspect the guns and see what the problem is. And when he looks at them, he notices the gun's elevating screws weren't tight enough. So he adjusted them to correct the issue. So just like you, Mary, Battery B had a few loose screws, right? But he fixed that, and then Antietam now became more and more vicious because the battery beat guns were raking the Confederates. Antietam was shocking, and Gibbon wrote to his wife Fanny about it. Gibbon called his wife Fanny Mama in these letters.
Yeah, my dear Mama. I was like, what's going on there?
I don't know what's going on with that. But anyway, so I quote, Mama, I am sure I am as tired of war as you are, and I'm perfectly willing not to see another battlefield. Now, after the Battle of Antietam, Abraham Lincoln is going to visit the troops on October 4th, and the president and Gibbon are going to meet and have a very weird exchange.
Oh, is this the fall of the Roman Empire story?
So Lincoln says to Gibbon, are you the Gibbon who wrote the history and decline of the Roman Empire? He was confusing John Gibbon with the British author Edwin Gibbon, who happened to be dead for 70 years. Gibbon kind of looks at him and kind of furrowed his brow a little bit, and Gibbon kind of hints of things to come. He goes, no, I'm the Gibbon who wrote the artillerist manual, which, by the way, got no interest from your War Department. Lincoln laughed and said he'd look into it. Now, Lincoln was likely busting his balls about Edward Gibbon, but give credit to Gibbon for snapping back without batting an eyelash at the president, because he was mad his book wasn't being picked up.
Yeah. Well, Lincoln said, I shall have Stanton give you another hearing.
And you're going to appreciate the comedy with these guys.
Oh, yeah.
You definitely can. Of course, you can Google the picture and see the famous picture of, you can see Humphreys in the picture, and of course Gibbon and all those guys. But November 4th of 1862, Gibbon's going to find himself promoted again, this time to division command in John Reynolds' First Corps. Now, he was very happy with the promotion, but he was very sad to leave his command of his famous black hats, especially one that he had developed into one of the absolute best in the United States Army, right? Gibbon's going to write of it. Tonight on November 4th was a sad one. For the next morning, I was to be separated not only from my gallant brigade, but from my own battery which accompanied my brigade into battle. Now, the real concern for Gibbon was who was going to take over his black hats.
Yep.
And when he found out who it was, he was pissed.
He was not happy about it at all.
Gibbon was proud and felt an ownership to those Westerners, and he looked out for them, right? It was also part of his character, and he felt that the replacement wasn't worthy of taking his former command. His replacement was Solomon Meredith, Long Sol Mary, 6'7", 250 pounds, a giant from Guilford, North Carolina, who moved to Wayne County, Indiana at age 19, and famously said he walked the entire distance from Carolina to Indiana. Probably uphill both ways, too, by the way, just saying, right? But Gibbon did not like Meredith, and he complained to Joseph Hooker about his appointment. If you ever get a chance to read Gibbon's memoirs, it's really, really good. It's one of the better ones. And in it he writes, quote, with despair, I rode to General Hooker's headquarters and was greeted with his usual candid manner. I made the case before him, frankly telling him why I do not want this brigadier general to have command of my brigade. The character of the troops comprised he knew well, speaking to Hooker. I'm asking to assign him elsewhere where he could do as little harm as possible. Hooker, of course, refused and told Gibbon, I have no choice. Meredith is a political guy from Washington. He knows a lot of people. Although I have a similar opinion of Meredith as you, my hands are tied. That's all paraphrasing. Yeah. Gibbon hears that, and he's going to write later, quote, I insisted that if he, Hooker, were responsible for the creation of an incompetent officer, that he should keep him in his own command. What's he saying? If you're going to put this guy in general, you can babysit him in your corps. Don't put him in ours, right? And so Gibbon was an opinionated fella, but he accepted the fact that he lost his political battle to Meredith, and he's going to move on to his own command. Now remember, Gibbon has no political clout. He's got nobody.
He's a lot like John Buford was the same way. Like John Buford didn't really have friends in Washington, and because of that, Buford stays kind of behind the scenes for a little bit, and all of a sudden, by the time Gettysburg rolls around, he's starting to make a name for himself. Gibbon is very much like that. Like, he's not one to go and ask for favors or anything like that. I think he wants to know that he earned it on his own.
And he demands it of others, but this is not going to be the last time Gibbon is going to have issues with a superior officer. It becomes a pattern with him as this goes on. But in December of 1862, Gibbon's going to find himself in Fredericksburg, Virginia, as part of that left Grand Division of the First Corps under Reynolds. And now his division is going to be completely comprised of men from eastern states. No more Westerners. they're going to attack Stonewall Jackson's men at Prospect Hill again and his old friend D.H. Hill. Now, this was the famous slaughter pen, and again would put him against his brothers in the 28th North Carolina under Colonel Samuel Lowe. Now, this battle was also the first time that Gibbon's going to get wounded. Just a slight wrist wound, but enough to send him back to Washington to recover. So while he's back in the capital, Abraham Lincoln is going to call on him to see how things were going and want an update of the battle. So this is, okay, it's important because Gibbon, like I said, he's got no real political friends in D.C., so if the president comes a-calling, that's kind of a big deal for him.
Yep.
Gibbon will return to the Army, but not until March of 1863, and again, he's going to find himself reassigned, this time to command the 2nd Division and the 2nd Corps under Darius Couch, Gibbon's classmate from West Point.
Yep.
Gibbon's star was slowly rising, but he still wanted his own corps. That's what he wanted. When you're commanding your corps, there are less people ahead of you to give you crap. That's how he saw it, right?
Yeah, he's tired of taking BS from people. When he also returns, Hooker is now in charge of the army. And it's interesting to see how Gibbon writes of some of these other officers. So he describes Hooker as having a strange composition. He said at Bull Run, he had a cool, gallant bearing. And he said his apparently frank manner and agreeable address attracted everybody who approached him, and his coolness and nerve at Antietam gained him a great deal of additional renown. But, he said in private, Hooker was in the habit of talking very freely and did not hesitate to criticize not only his brother officers, but his commander. He, like Kearny, always felt that the full credit was not given him for his fighting qualities. But the one thing that Gibbon says that Hooker did really well was the changes he made to the Army of the Potomac. So bringing in fresh bread, the reorganization of it. And one thing that he especially liked was the corps badges. He felt that, gave a way to, you could see where the men were, and it just gave them this whole, they're more of a cohesive unit. He does say, though, that Kearny gets partial credit for those corps badges.
He does.
Yeah.
Now, Gibbon, once he arrived with the 2nd Corps, he began to clean house. So he's going to dump Brigadier Generals Alfred Scully, who lost control of his men when their papers were set to expire, and then Joshua Owen, the commander of the Philadelphia Brigade. Gibbon had a particular hatred towards Joshua Owen, who not only fired him from his job, but also had him arrested. Now, one explanation given was that Owen allowed civilians to pass uncontested to the brigade's picket line regularly. Another said it was because Owen's reputation for drinking. Allegedly, he got in a drunken brawl one night in October of 1862 with a then Lieutenant Colonel Dennis O'Kane of the 69th Pennsylvania. Now, most agree that it kind of came out of nowhere, his firing, and it was unexpected, but strangely, Gibbon never mentioned this in his memoirs, The Recollections of the Civil War. So who knows? The other thing that was going on at this time is his 1-year-old son, John, died around this time.
Yep.
So it's also possible Gibbon's mood was particularly foul for what was going on.
Yeah.
But when he did, the one thing that's definitely true is when he came to the 2nd Corps again, he cleaned out the brigade commanders.
Yeah.
Again, regardless, Gibbon was a tough disciplinarian, and Owen was a drunken, loose cannon, probably called creepy by local bartenders, probably, right? And since Owen commanded the popular Philadelphia Brigade, he likely wanted someone he trusted to command them.
Yeah.
So enter Alexander Webb, the hand-picked man by Gibbon, the hard-charging 28-year-old New Yorker who would assume command of the famous Philadelphia Brigade. I'm sure the prospect of a New Yorker commanding Philly guys went very well, by the way, amongst the men, but that's what happens sometimes, right? Next up for Gibbon is going to be the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, this battle, although he didn't bump into as many as he thought he would, it involved much of his West Point class, A.P. Hill, Cadmus Wilcox, Henry Heath, not to mention, like you said, his cousin J. Johnson Pettigrew, as well as another possible encounter with his brothers from the 28th North Carolina.
Yeah.
That was former brigade, which is now called the Iron Brigade, famously fought on the first day, while on that battle's second day on July 2nd, one of his brigades under William Harrow would do some of the hardest fighting in the Union Army. We're talking the 1st Minnesota, 82% casualties, as well as the 19th Maine, the 15th Mass. But Gibbon's division at Antietam, at Gettysburg, is probably best known for their defense of the West Wall at the angle in the Pickett-Pettigrew-Trimble charge, a.k.a. Pickett's Charge.
Yep.
Right? Gibbon is now under command of who?
General Winfield Scott
Winfield
Hancock.
Scott, old Winnie Boy, who had replaced Couch as the 2nd Corps commander after Chancellorsville when Couch took his ball and went home because he hated Joe Hooker. And he basically was replaced by George Meade on June 28th. Now, Gibbon and Meade, like we said earlier, were friends from their Florida days in 1850. And during the night of July 2nd at Meade's Council of War, it was Gibbon who chimed in first, as a lower officer, and voted to remain and fight. But what is interesting is after that meeting broke up, Meade approached Gibbon, not Hancock, and told him, if Lee attacks, it'll be on your front. He went out of his way. Now, Gibbon let Meade know that if he was right, that he would defeat him. So when that morning came on July 3rd, Gibbon knew this is very well could be possibly his last day of life.
Yep.
So at 10:30 a.m., Gibbon's going to write Fanny, and he wrote, quote, "My darling mama, we had a great battle yesterday, commencing at 4 p.m. and continued long after dark. Kiss the dear children from me and write often." So you're seeing him softening up now, whether because his son John had died or that summer, but he's becoming more family. So he's going away from that guy to more of a family guy. And you're seeing it in his letters as it goes on.
And I noticed that in his memoirs too. It's kind of like Rufus Dawes in a way, where you have this guy who's very hard fighting at the beginning, but then as time goes on, you can see that he's thinking more of his family. And that's one thing I came away with from Gibbon, from reading his letters and reading his memoirs. The account of when he lost his son is very sad. He said, "I know nothing sadder in the midst of blood and suffering and death, with thousands dying in a few hours, than to hear unexpectedly of the death of some loved one far away in a quiet home. And yet mine was probably only one of many thousand cases during the 4 long years of our bloody war." So he's recognizing that he's very, he knew nothing sadder at that point, but he's recognizing that he's also not the only one. So he's very aware of it. But he definitely is becoming, more of a family man at this time, wanting to be home with them. But I would encourage all of our listeners, if you can find it, actually, it's available. If you just Google John Gibbon Civil War Memoirs, it will come up for you. Hathi Trust has it for free. Read his account of Pickett's charge. It is it's really detailed.
Especially when he wasn't there for most of it. We'll talk about that. But just after lunch, a boiled chicken, Rebel artillery is going to open up at 1:07 p.m., and Gibbons wrote that, quote, "The men of the 2nd Corps hugged the ground while the U.S. artillery returned fire." Now, when he saw that long that gray line come out of the woods in their front, he wrote about that great wave of men marching towards them. One of Gibbon's closest friends and top aide, a man named Frank Haskell, he was ordered to go find Meade and warn him that the rebel infantry was approaching and send everything he could. Now, reportedly, Meade was up on Little Round Top at this point inspecting the lines and was near the 146th New York, when Pickett's charge started. Now, who knows that's where he was, but I will say on their monument, if you go to Little Round Top today, it does say that, so we have to assume that's probably true. Gibbon directed Webb's Philadelphia Brigade along that west wall not to fire until they crossed the Emmitsburg Road, while he helped direct the Federal artillery. Now, Frank Haskell wrote of this moment. This is his quote now. "General Gibbon rode down the line cool and calm, and in an unimpassioned voice said to the men, 'Do not hurry, men, and fire too fast. Let them come up close before you fire, and then aim low and steadily.' The coolness of General was reflected in the faces of his men." Frank Haskell adored John Gibbon.
Yeah,
and he described him this way in his memoirs, just by the by. Speaking of Gibbon, quote, "He is compactly made, neither spare nor corpulent," great word, "with ruddy complexion, chestnut brown hair, with a clean-shaven face, except, of course, for that mustache with reddish in color. Deep blue, calm eyes, slightly aquiline nose, with an air of firmness in his manner. He always looks well-dressed." The moral, Mary? Find someone in your life who looks at you the way Frank Haskell writes about John Gibbon.
The mustache description. That mustache.
Wow. And he wrote, but anyways, it was right around this time that Gibbon is going to be shot behind the left shoulder, and he quickly lost blood. This is pretty much the beginning of Pickett's charge. So when he turned command over to his division to a man named William Harrow, we talked about, and he left the field. At this point, Haskell is looking for Meade, and he's gone to find him. He'll return, and he cannot find Gibbon nor General Hancock, who had also been wounded a couple hundred yards south of the angle. Haskell is going to write of this moment, quote, "Great heavens, were my senses mad? Webb's brigade near the clump of trees was breaking near their works, and the men were flocking back in confusion. The fate of Gettysburg was hung upon a spider's thread. So you can just imagine. So when you see just how this whole thing's breaking apart, Armistead's breaking through. You can just kind of maybe the 26th North Carolina. You can just see how it's all going.
Haskell's account of it is very, very detailed as well. Like you can just imagine the chaos that they're feeling, and this is right at exactly where Meade predicted it would be chaotic at Gibbon's center.
Now Haskell and Meade are going to rally the brigade in lieu of their court leadership, because don't forget Hancock's down and so is Gibbon now. When Norman Hall's brigade is going to arrive, the Rebs are finally driven back, but it's important to note that two of Gibbon's hand-picked men, both Frank Haskell and Alexander Webb, helped save the day at its worst moment to stall Pickett's charge. Probably why he got rid of those brigade guys. He wanted guys he wanted at the big moment. Gibbon always gave credit to his subordinates. He wrote of Haskell, quote, "I've always thought that of him, more than any one man, are we indebted for the repulse of Lee's assault." So when you're looking at Pickett's charge and how it went down, you have to look at Gibbon, you got to look at Webb, you got to look at Haskell, and specifically what they did to slow that gray roll. Now you can go right down the line. There's 69 Pennsylvania. There's a whole bunch of people we can talk about. But when the breakthrough happened, Webb was able to maintain control with Haskell, along with some of these other men to drive them back. And so when Haskell was the one who reportedly had told Meade of the results, according to Haskell, he found Meade and said, quote, "I believe, General, that the enemy's attack is repulsed." Meade replied, "Thank God, hurrah, hurrah." There are rumors, Mary, that Meade may have even smiled, but they are unsubstantiated. But this is what was going on. Haskell then went to go find Gibbon, and then Hancock in the field hospitals was passed on the news. Now, Haskell's account of this battle appears in his book, The Battle of Gettysburg, and is a great read, and one that was used throughout the Ken Burns documentary. Speaking of Haskell, that's where he gets his name from. Gibbon, again, once injured, is going to return to Philadelphia to rehab, and will return to the battlefield on November 19th of 1863 for what?
He would return there for the Gettysburg Address with Frank Haskell. Now, what's funny is when he is convalescing, so first they send him to Cleveland, Ohio, and Gibbon remarks, "I felt really out of place there. I didn't know anybody." And then they sent him to back to Pennsylvania, and he's like, "I felt at home and I knew people." And he actually goes to see Meade at one point when he's recovering and all that. But yeah, as you said, he's going to be at the dedication of the Soldiers National Cemetery on November 19th, 1863 with Frank Haskell, and he's going to witness the Gettysburg Address, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
That he got to witness that.
Now, Gibbon up to this point, for the most part, had avoided military politics. But during his convalescence, you said it, so I'm going to say it, cool word, right? He wrote a letter defending his friend George Meade during that whole Dan Sickles-George Meade debate. And one thing was clear, when Gibbon returned, he felt he earned Corps command at this point, right? Meade was in the process of reorganizing that Army of the Potomac and was looking for a spot for Gibbon. Now, Meade had actually considered Gibbon to command the 6th Corps when he was going to send John Sedgwick to the Shenandoah Valley. But that Valley job would eventually go to Franz Sigel after vacating the dance floor from the 11th Corps, paving the way for one Oliver Otis Howard to take over, right? But in the end, Sedgwick is going to ultimately stay with the 6th Corps, and all Gibbons received was a Laurel and Hardy handshake, right? The best Meade could offer him was maybe the night spot at the DQ over there in Hanover. But he didn't have anything for him. So Gibbon was, of course, disappointed, to say the least, at being passed over by Meade, especially after going on a limb to support him in his feud with Dan Sickles. In his memoirs, again, Gibbon writes, quote, "I must admit I was not enthusiastic about taking the field again. Cries recommended for promotion by Army commanders, but the promotion did not come, and I began to utter words that were not patriotic."
No, you can see he's starting, and I think at this point he's starting to kind of like, he's growing weary of being in battle. He's growing weary of fighting.
I think he's feeling like, what am I doing this for?
Yeah, he's like, is there a glass ceiling for me? Like, because I'm Southern? Like, what is it here?
Like, no matter what I do, I'm being passed over. So by March of 1864, Gibbon, he'd been wounded. He'll return to duty after recovering from that shoulder wound. And this was right when U.S. Grant was now commanding all Union armies in the midst of planning those campaigns of 1864. Overland, Bermuda 100, Red River, the Valley. This is when everything was getting ready to go. But being home with his family for so long clearly continued to change Gibbon, who had turned, like we said, from that hard-nosed military man to someone who didn't want to be away from home anymore. He writes home again, quote, "Dear Mama, my whole soul is wrapped up in you, and my dear children, I will not be satisfied until I constantly hear from you." Now, he also, the soldiers talked about, he became that guy in camp who kept showing everybody pictures of his kids.
Yep.
And that's who he turned into. He suddenly turned into a real capital F family man. Mm-hmm. Now, he did get his old job back, commanding the 2nd Division of the 2nd Corps under Hancock. And he was now joined by fellow division commanders Francis Barlow, the hero of Spotsylvania, as well as David Bell Birney, the Alabama-born hardcore abolitionist who'd moved to Philly in his younger days. Now, the 2nd Corps is going to get decimated throughout the Overland campaign, and they just lose men left and right.
They're like a shell of themselves after I think a lot of the corps after Gettysburg didn't really recover, and the 2nd is one of them.
No, and Gibbon's also dealing with more personal losses. May 8th of 1864, he's going to sit down to dinner with John Sedgwick. The next day, Sedgwick's going to be killed at Spotsylvania. Oof. All through it, Gibbon maintained a tough facade the best he could. Thomas Lineman, he was an aide to Grant and a native of the Great Waltham, Massachusetts, Mary. He's going to write, quote, "By the roadside was Gibbon. In a tower of strength he was, cool as a steel knife as always, and unmoved by anything and everything. He is the most American of Americans." Now, fun fact about Lyman, his wife Mimi was the first cousin of Robert Gould Shaw. Lyman owned the land on Cape Cod known as Buttermilk Bay.
Interesting.
Where the Bourne Braves receive our annual championship ring celebration. That was owned by Lyman, that whole area.
That's cool.
But the real personal loss Gibbon felt during the Overland campaign was the loss of Frank Haskell, who was killed at Cold Harbor. Now, Haskell had been promoted to colonel of the 36th Wisconsin on June 3rd, 1864, and had been moved up temporarily to brigade command when its commander, H. Boyd McKean, from the Wheatfield over here, Gettysburg, was killed. Now, Haskell was shot in the temple and killed instantly, charging the breastworks of the Battle of Cold Harbor. Gibbons writes of it, quote, "My God, I've lost my best friend, and one of the best soldiers in the Army of the Potomac has fallen." What Haskell did not know was Gibbon had planned to officially, permanently promote him to brigadier general the next day. And whenever he wrote letters home about Haskell, he always referred to him as poor Haskell from that point on. So, while suffering personal loss, Gibbon's relationship with his corps commander, Winfield Scott Hancock, began to unravel, and as time went on, their personal feud grew and grew.
Especially after Reams Station.
Right, but even before that.
Yep.
I don't know if you know this, Mary. Hancock was not easy to deal with, nor to work for.
No.
He wasn't. Similar to Stonewall Jackson, he arrested subordinates at will. He demanded a lot from his division commanders. No shame in that. I mean, you want to have high standards, no question. If you need proof, go down to the local town carnival, go see Miss Cleo, ask her to do a seance with Eliakim Sherrill, and see what he says about old Winnie Boy. Okay, there you go, right? Gibbon had dealt with it for a long time. And just like our official podcast consigliere and photographer, he said, enough. He finally had enough, right? So in his memoirs, Gibbons gives detail on what went down with Hancock. This is his quote now, quote, "To my surprise, General Hancock turned to me and said, 'General Gibbon, is your division in motion?' I replied, 'No, sir, I have received no orders to move it.' He then explained, 'I gave you an order a half an hour ago.' With some considerable surprise, I said, 'General, I have not received an order. My troops await your orders.' And then he insisted, quote, that he gave me orders to move, and I replied, 'General, either I am very stupid this morning or you are very unintelligible, because I do not receive any orders.' As he did sometimes when he was very excited, he appealed to a staff officer around him to confirm his statement, and the officer said the order was for Gibbon to hold his troops in readiness to move, confirming Gibbon was right and Hancock was wrong.
Ouch. That's not going to go over well.
Apparently, Hancock was mad like someone took his last donut, right? This miscommunication escalated into a personal feud between the two that would lead to a legit hatred. The next day, Gibbons is hanging around the fire with Phil Sheridan and a couple of other officers. All of a sudden, they hear Hancock riding up and he angrily yells, "Is Gibbon here?" When Gibbon acknowledged his presence, Hancock demanded to know who made out the current battle line. Gibbon said it was me. Hancock then began to scream at Gibbon in front of Sheridan and his men, and he said, quote, "I would be ashamed of any officer who would make such a line." Gibbon defended it, basically said, "What's wrong with it? What's the problem?" Hancock demanded Gibbon mount up and ride with him so he could show him. So Gibbon's going to get on his horse, going to ride with old Winnie Boy. When they got to the point on the line that concerned Hancock, he pointed to where some of the men had entrenched and said that the breastworks were faulty because they were too low. And Gibbon said, well, that's because the artillery placement made that spot on the line irrelevant. Hancock was, quote, staggered per Gibbon at his explanation and told him, quote, "I will hold you responsible if anything may happen here." Gibbon was clearly mad, and he said, quote, "General, I am perfectly willing to be held so responsible if you had not come to that decision before insulting me in such a way before half a dozen officers in this army." Hancock must have realized that he was wrong at this point, and he offered to ride back and apologize to him in front of the men,
Wow.
which he did. Gibbons wrote, quote, "The relationship between General Hancock and myself never afterward resumed the cordiality before that existed." And this is when Ream Station happens, right? August 25th, 1864, just outside of Petersburg. And this is going to, for the most part, is going to end the Second Corps' days as a strong fighting force, right? I mean, we did a whole episode on Ream Station, but just to summarize, the Second Corps lost 2,300 men. It was a complete disaster for Hancock. Gibbon's letter to his wife described it, quote, "Dear Mama, it was a severe and terrible battle and a mortifying one for the Second Corps, which is beginning to feel pretty well used up. I thought more than once I'd seen you for the last time."
He said it was really disheartening to him how the troops were they didn't want to fight anymore. Oh. And he realized that they're wearing down and they're not.
His division, Gibbon's division at this point was about as strong as a Baltimore Orioles bullpen. Okay. He messaged Hancock afterwards and suggested that his division be dissolved and spread out among the remaining ones.
That's not a bad request.
It's not. But this is when Hancock is going to angrily respond back to Gibbon, quote, "Perhaps you should give up command of your division."
So basically saying, you're the problem.
Well, I'm the a-hole?
Yeah, that's what I was like.
Right?
I'm the a-hole?
He's saying, what? Maybe it's you. Gibbons decided that his cup of F's with this guy was completely empty. And he wrote back offering his resignation and asking to be relieved of duty. Now, when Hancock got that message, asking to be relieved of duty, he demanded Gibbon report him immediately. And when they met, Hancock said he didn't have time for this and that he needs to withdraw his resignation as soon as possible. Gibbons told him that he was tired of being insulted and Hancock, was the reason why he was resigning.
Yep.
Hancock then got up and stormed out of the meeting.
Did you imagine that?
Yep, and walked away.
He just, but Gibbon felt that he had the right as the commander to demand when subordinates be relieved of command if he felt that they were not fighting up to what he wanted. Like, it's not, I'm not trying to defend either one here, but okay, maybe Gibbon a little bit, but like, it's not a bad request. And then, of course, Hancock goes and he's going to guilt trip Gibbon, saying Gibbon is going to be accused of deserting a sinking ship if he leaves. And Gibbon felt that Hancock had told me in plain terms I no longer had his confidence as a commander. I could do nothing else than to ask to be relieved. And Hancock again pleads with him to withdraw his application, but Gibbon doesn't back down. Hancock finally admits, "I was mad when I wrote that letter," and Gibbon says he's aware of that, but he, as you said, his cup of F's is gone.
Yeah, they had a good adult conversation, but I realized, that the divorce was done. Hancock was calmer. He definitely had calmed down. But again, Hancock's saying things like, if you leave now, your reputation is going to be destroyed. You're leaving at the worst possible moment. And Gibbon's like, you know what? I never cared about reputation. It was clear that, like you said, Hancock had lost complete confidence in him. And it took 2 hours back and forth till finally Hancock agreed, withdraw your letter and I'll withdraw my angry letter. Hancock then took Gibbon's resignation letter. He put it into a candle, lit it on fire, and put it in the fireplace. And they parted on what was called amicable terms. But their relationship, again, never was really improved. Their contact going forward was basically cold and very businesslike at that point. I mean, they never were best buddies. There was never a feety pajama sleepover at any point in their career.
There was a lot, and I mean, there's a lot of ego going on between the two of them. In early September of 1864, Gibbon is going to briefly command the 18th Corps, and he would be commanding in the absence of General Ord, who had to take leave. And this is what Gibbon had to say about it. The relief of getting away from my disagreeable surroundings was very great, and this was still further increased by the comparative quiet which reigned along the lines of the 18th Corps, as contrasted with the constant popping of the picket line rifles and the roar of artillery in the lines that I had just left. So it sounds like the sounds of battle are starting to get to Gibbon at this point too. So there's there's two things going on with this quote. One, he's glad to get away from Hancock, and two, he's glad to get away from the sounds of rifles and the sounds of artillery lines.
Yeah, you got to get away. I mean, at some point, Hancock was going to leave the army on November 26th of 64, and basically, his wound is be too much to bear. Can't blame him for that one.
No.
But Gibbons has dreams dancing in his head now that he's going to take over command of the Second Corps.
Yeah.
And he's excited, but it didn't happen. It went to Andrew Humphreys, who would command it off and on for the rest of the war. Francis Barlow and Gershom Mott would kind of each have their own temporary stints, but he got passed over again. And when he did, this is when he decided, maybe this isn't for me. Maybe I should just give it the old quit. This is ridiculous. It's never going to happen. But on January 1st, 1865, Gibbons will finally get his own corps when he was named commander of the 24th Corps in Ord's Army of the James.
Yeah.
Now, he's still under Ord's overall command, but he loved Ord. But he also had his own Army Corps and less officers, again, above to report to. And Ord was very friendly with Sherman. He was very friendly with Grant. And after Hancock, Gibbon must have felt like he died and went to heaven.
Yeah, he said, it was difficult to conceal my pleasure and satisfaction at the receipt of the news. He loves being under the command of General Ord, I think, and the one thing that Gibbon said about that in his memoirs was he felt like he had independence. So I think he's insinuating that Hancock might have been a bit of a micromanager, and Gibbon didn't like that. He wanted to know that he had the trust of his commander and not to constantly be like, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that?
Absolutely. April 2nd of 1865, Gibbons probably got his best moment as a Corps commander when he led his Corps to a victory at Fort Gregg, that key battle that finally chased Lee and made him abandon Richmond. Now, Fort Gregg, also known as the Battle of Third Petersburg, was a brutal battle where wave after wave of Union troops are going to attack until the 12th West Virginia is going to break through and they're going to raise their flag over Fort Gregg. But when when Lee surrendered at Appomattox on April 9th, Gibbon was present and would be selected as one of the 3 Union peace commissioners, along with Wesley Merritt and Charles Griffin, to finalize Grant's and Lee's terms that were made the day before. The 3 Confederates were James Longstreet, John Brown Gordon, and William Pendleton. Now, the 6 men used Gibbon's field desk to write their notes on, and when the meeting ended, you know what Gibbon did? He had them all carve their initials into the desk.
That's so cool.
And sign it as a souvenir. And you can go to the Appomattox Visitor Center today and you can go see it. We saw, if you remember, we went there. They have them all in there. Gibbon's last days of the American Civil War basically spent in the Clover Hill Tavern, which uses that printing press that we went to copy 30,000 parole forms for the Confederates to complete. Now, one funny story at this time was Gibbon's sister wrote him asking to visit him. The war was over, and she wanted to see him again. So John also messaged his brother Nicholas, who was fighting with the 28th North Carolina, to join her and, quote, if he was agreeable. Nicholas responded to John with a 5-word message. You know what it said? I will not be agreeable. So old habits die hard, apparently.
Wow.
I have a brother, too. I know the feeling, But his last act was to discharge his troops, which he did on June 13th in Richmond. He thanked them for their service, and he said, quote, the great Civil War was a thing of the past, and wear your Corps emblem with pride. Like you said, he loved the Corps thing.
Yeah.
Right? When the war was over, Gibbon reverted back to colonel with the U.S. Regular Army, was sent to Fort Sanders, which is over in Wyoming, where a meeting was held in July of 1868 now to discuss the Transcontinental Railroad. And we were talking about this last night. Present at this meeting was U.S. Grant, Phil Sheridan, William Sherman, and there is a photo you can look where all of them are all together wearing their civilian clothes.
And they're with their wives, too.
With their wives. So it's a very rare picture to see Grant and Sherman dressed up in their civvies.
Yeah, it was, and you can see, like, Gibbon's wife is, like, you can see her quite clearly, but then Gibbon is kind of off to the side. He's near where Sherman is. And Gibbon's daughter, Katie, is in the picture as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, Gibbon's military days were not over, though. In 1869, he took command of the U.S. 7th Infantry in Utah and then eventually Montana. Now, Gibbon, he fell in love with the West. He explored the Rocky Mountains. He helped establish the Yellowstone National Park in 1871.
I think he's got a waterfall named after him there.
Gibbons Falls, which is along the Gibbon River. There you go, right? In the spring of 1876, the Great War with the Sioux began over the Black Hills as the Lakota Sioux and the North Cheyenne fought the U.S. Army for ownership of the Black Hills, where Mount Rushmore is now.
Yep.
The Native Americans refused to give up their ancestral lands, and soon war broke out, and Gibbon found himself in the middle of it. Now, Gibbon is going to lead one of 3 columns, along with George Crook and Alfred Terry, who was accompanied by who?
George Custer.
George Custer, 7th U.S. Cavalry. Here we go, right? They were chomping at the bit to go fight, and in a meeting on June 22nd, 1876, I guess Custer was like,
you gotta go.
Gibbon said, quote, "There will be plenty of Indians and no need for Custer to be so greedy."
Oh my God.
Basically saying, don't worry, we're all going to get the Indian, right?
Yeah.
As you know, it didn't turn out too well, because on June 26th, Gibbon will arrive at a place called Little Bighorn to find the battle was over, and Custer and hundreds of his men were mutilated. Many of them were stripped, scalped, riddled with bullet holes. I mean,
wasn't the horse the only survivor?
I mean, there's
Comanche.
There's a whole bunch of stories with this whole thing with that, but it didn't obviously end well, and there's a lot of good stuff you can study with Custer and stuff like that. But years later, in 1877, Gibbon is going to be called upon again to fight another tribe. This time, it's the Nez Perce, led by Chief Joseph and their warrior Looking Glass.
Yeah.
Now, Gibbon was ordered to stop the Nez Perce tribe from escaping into where?
They were going to Canada.
Into Canada, Mary.
And he's ordered this by General Oliver Otis Howard, who is commanding the Department of Columbia out west at the time.
Exactly. So you go bag these guys before they get to Canada. And from their ancestral land in the Pacific Northwest, after the United States violated the Walla Walla Treaty of 1855, right? They fought at the Battle of Big Hole, which saw Gibbon retreat to again await the arrival of Howard.
Yeah.
Now, 2 months later, Chief Joseph, they called him Red Napoleon, by the way, surrendered to Howard on October 5th of 1877, where he's going to famously say, "I am tired, I will fight no more forever." But this is when John Gibbon remembered Captain Casey back in Florida, about how he treated the Seminoles in 1850. And then he's going to basically turn into a champion of the Native cause and treated them with dignity, just as Captain Casey did with the Knolls back in 1848, right around there.
Yeah.
Gibbon lobbied for a reservation in the Pacific Northwest. In 1881, he wrote an essay called The Indian Question, where Gibbon wrote, quote, "How would we feel? How would we act if our country were overrun and wrested from us by another race? The Indian, although a savage, is still a man with the same sense of right and wrong as the white man." So so obviously he remembered Casey. There's no question that it fell back to that. But this is when he's going to start to really get into his memoirs. And when he starts to write about his memoirs, he turns into a mean girl again. He remembers all the people who did him wrong.
Yep.
He had a list of grievances. It was Festivus every day for Gibbon. He starts going at guys like John Pope, Irvin McDowell, and of course Hancock.
Yep.
If you read a lot of this, Gibbon is going to get promoted to brigadier general in the regular army after his former colonel of the 6th Wisconsin, Edward Bragg, now a congressman, is going to lead his campaign. Now, he was stationed at Fort Vancouver, which is over in Oregon, along the Columbia River, and was commander of the Department of the Columbia. I mean, he loved the West. It must have been a sweet gig for him.
Yeah, and it's funny. Him and Howard they often will change commands, and being like, because Howard was in command of the Department of Columbia for a while, and then Gibbon took over for it. It's just interesting how that all works out. They often followed each other in their commands. And during his tenure in the Department of Columbia, he's going to place Seattle, Washington under martial law during the anti-Chinese riots in 1886. And also in 1886, Gibbon is going to go back to West Point, where he's going to deliver the commencement address
But you know what's so funny was he must have been so happy in Vancouver. Then this is not Vancouver, British Columbia. This is Vancouver, Washington, right? But in his home at the Vancouver barracks with he has a brand new invention at his home. You know what it's called? The telephone.
Yep.
Right? So soon crank calls were delivered with unwanted pizzas to the home of Winfield Scott Hancock, I'm sure, back east. I'm just guessing, right? Although that would true, the pizzas probably would have been welcome, but it doesn't matter. But later that year, the 58-year-old Gibbon found himself in Madison, Wisconsin, and discovered an Iron Brigade reunion was taking place at the GAR Hall. And this is a great story with Gibbon because it shows his personality. Gibbon is going to find this Iron Brigade reunion. He's going to knock on the door unexpectedly, when an old man answered the door and asked who the visitor was. Gibbon responded, "My name is John Gibbon, and I'm looking for the bastard who dressed my horse in white leggings." And of course, the men laughed, realized it was him. He went inside. He was thrilled, a sense of the Wisconsin Civil War veterans. And so he's kind of enjoying his life at this point. In 1888, not far away in Portland, Oregon, a new cyclorama is going to open on the anniversary year of the Battle of Gettysburg. And it's going to feature a 360-degree painting of the battle, similar to Paul Philippeau's painting that appeared in Chicago, Boston, and now resides up the street here at the new Visitor Center in Gettysburg. Now, Gibbon decided to invite his friend Chief Joseph to see it. Gibbon and Chief Joseph became close when he moved to Oregon and visited the reservation at the Lake Chelan and became really sympathetic to their plight. He made sure they got winter clothes, they were fed well. I mean, Gibbon really, really took a shine to Chief Joseph. He just absolutely did. So you can imagine these two warriors are standing on the platform, and they're going to look at that painting when Chief Joseph says to Gibbon, quote, "It proved what my father said, that when the white men get mad and fight amongst themselves, they kept it up until the lake was made of blood." Gibbon is going to spend the rest of his days writing his memoirs, which will go unpublished until 1928.
Yep.
This is 32 years after his death now.
And then in 1994, his Adventures on the Western Frontier is finally going to be published.
And I think it was his granddaughter, or his daughter, who actually was the ones who made these things public. By the time that these were published, most of the generals were gone, and the notes and letters were his last connections to the Civil War for him, right? John Gibbon's going to die on February 2nd of 1896 in Baltimore, Maryland, and is buried today at Arlington National Cemetery. Now, the thing about it, at the time of his death, Gibbon remained a relatively unknown, and he wasn't really a top-shelf A-lister name that he probably is today.
But he wrote a lot of magazine articles, and in these he would often recount his time in the West or the Civil War, or he would provide his opinions on the government's policy towards Native Americans as well. So he's a prolific writer in like the way that Oliver Otis Howard was post-war as well.
But what happened was in 1898, he got famous. This is years. This changed when Frank Haskell's memoirs got published. We mentioned that book he wrote, The Battle of Gettysburg, which shined a bright light on John Gibbon as the hero of the Battle of Gettysburg and made him a household name. On July 3rd of 1988, on the 125th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, his statue was dedicated on Cemetery Ridge at the center of the Union line where his men fought. There was an old Patriot coach, Mary, that used to say, "Do your job," right? And John Gibbon epitomized that motto. I mean, he was a man who avoided the limelight, he treated his men well, and he trained them hard, but yet remained sympathetic to those who he felt were treated unfairly. And despite his military background, he valued family and friends more than anything in the world.
Yep.
And it's a side of John Gibbon people don't realize who he was. People associate him with the Iron Brigade. He's made of iron. You know, he's grumpy and all that stuff.
He looks like a tough guy in his pictures and stuff. And that's the one thing I found, like, he's very much family and friends person, and especially as the war goes on. And the other thing, too, that you learn from his memoirs is that you can see that the battle, the Civil War and the battle, the sounds of battle are wearing on him, because he said when he was able to be in the Army of the James and, you know, working under General Ord, where it was much calmer for him, he said that it was much better on his nerves. And one of the reasons for that was there was less sounds of battle. So it's clear that the war was starting to take its toll on him in the way it took its toll on pretty much everybody that fought in it.
There's no doubt. He's one of those guys like Rufus Dawes. You can read his memoirs. He changed as life goes on.
Yep. You can see that he's getting, like, he's like, I don't want to do this anymore. And he's a fascinating commander to study. He's ambitious. He has a bit of arrogance, but he's also very human. And as we said, especially if you read his memoirs or the letters to his wife, you will see another side of Gibbon that, a lot of us haven't seen before. And also too, just down from where his statue is, and I'm sure our listeners know this, there's a witness tree called the Gibbon tree, and that's near to where he was wounded during Pickett's charge, and it's still standing there today. It's an oak tree. And it was likely 14 years old at the time of the battle. Mm-hmm. So however, plus 160 some years, that's an old tree.
Yep, you can go visit it today. You can go visit his statue right along Cemetery Ridge, and you can really see all of it. It's a lot of great, great monuments for the Philadelphia Brigade, for Webb's guys, as well as the entire Second Corps and everything else. So I think, someone he deserves study. I think he's definitely had a light shined on him later on, and that's because of people like Frank Haskell, yep, as well as his own memoirs. Definitely read Haskell's book. Definitely read Gibbon's memoirs, because people who know who he is, and he's always in someone else's shadow. Yeah. If you look at it, he's in Hooker's shadow, he's in Hancock's shadow, he's in Ord's shadow. He's always under someone's shadow. But when you realize how good he was and how important he was to the big picture, and how he was, especially here at Gettysburg, yeah, and Antietam for that matter, you can really take a special appreciation. Because just like people think that Joshua Chamberlain is the hero of Little Round Top, and really it's Gouverneur K. Warren, yeah, it's really Gibbon who's the hero, yep, of Cemetery Ridge of the Pickett's charge. When you really think, yep, about it, he was. Because if it wasn't for getting rid of Ward and putting in Webb, who knows how history would have changed.
Him recognizing the guys that were going to be the ones that when the battle got tough, and he was warned. Meade said it's going to be at your center, and he was right, and Gibbon was prepared for it.
That was no question. So what's up for us next, Mary?
So we have a few episodes coming out soon. We don't have dates for them yet, but we will announce those soon. We are going to be having our friend Andrea Quinn, also known as AQ, on here to talk about General Francis Channing Barlow, another Gettysburg veteran, but also, just like Gibbon, was around for the entire Civil War and did lots of awesome stuff. So we're going to shine some light on him. And we will also be doing an episode at some point, probably closer to the anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, on Canada in the Civil War.
Yeah, and we're also going to be doing one with our friend Bill Etzgorn on Freemasonry in the Civil War. So a lot of cool stuff is coming, so definitely watch this spot. So we can jump off here, and we can finish this up and finish telling the story. So any final words from you?
Well, thank you for bringing it like you always do. Thank you to our listeners for being with us for these last 150 episodes. We wouldn't be here without you. And I'm really happy that our 150th episode was for General John Gibbon.
Absolutely, 150. So we're on to 200, Mary. Off we go. So everybody, we appreciate you listening. It's the weekend. Hopefully it's going to be nice where you are. Hopefully you can get out to the battlefield, see some things, and hopefully it isn't going to be raining too much. We'll be doing our live tomorrow on YouTube. Join us at 10 o'clock in the morning. If you're not, that's cool. We won't talk much behind your back as far as you know. But we'll be doing it, so definitely, hopefully you can jump on at that point. All right, so off we go. Everybody have a great final weekend. We will talk to you all on the other side.
See y'all later.
Peace out.
Bye.